This is the way Cannery Row looked in about 1934 when my wife and I came here on our honeymoon. We were fresh out of University of California, and we were interested in art and science and literature, and a very young couple. In fact, I had to wait a couple of weeks before Jean got to be 18 so we could get married without her parents' consent. This was a very busy world when we first came here, and contrary to the rest of the world, which was the bottom of the Depression in 1934, it was just about bottoming out before FDR came in. And the street during half the year, from about I guess September to April, was a very busy world, with thousands of people forging their way in from the various other jobs in the fruit picking in the inner valleys to spend the winter here in Monterey fishing. And sardines was a going concern at that time. Probably $10 million worth of income came from fishing of the sardines, which prior to about 1915 or 20 had been a non-existent business. In fact, the sardines originally were considered a pest, and they were always getting in the way of the salmon fishing, which was the only canning being done then by the Booth Canneries, which was down by the main fisherman's wharf. But Booth decided that something should be done about the sardines. There were so many of them. In fact, the bay was often so full of them that you practically walk on them. And sharks and other predatory fish would often drive them up on the beach even. And there would be swarms and schools of them dying on the beach. And they were quite a problem for cleaning up, and farmers came from Carmel Valley with wagons and trucks and trucked them out there to put in the ground for fertilizer, like the old Indians and priests used to do in the early Spanish days. But Booth decided that the only people who might know how to do this were the Norwegians, who had a big canning industry. So he sent over to Norway for a fellow named Hovden, Knut Hovden, who was a young engineer just getting out of college at the time in fishing engineering. And he came to Monterey and worked out an elaborate system for canning the Monterey sardine, which was quite different than the other sardines that were being canned around the world. Most of them were the Norwegian and Swedish type of sardine, which is only about 5 or 6 inches long, and the Monterey sardine was about 8 or 9 inches long, a big, lush, smelly animal. And Hovden worked out a system by which they could be put in big oval tins, and it really saved Monterey's neck as far as finance is concerned, because there was nothing doing in town at that time except the army. There was a small cavalry division in the Presidio, and Fort Ord had not been started yet. It was just a big, vast expanse of endless wasteland out beyond where Seaside is now. In fact, there were no buildings all along Fremont, and we used to walk along and across the sand dunes were all now in motels. Any of the lots out there could be practically taken for tax title, a couple dollars a piece, or even in one newspaper, the Call Bulletin was giving them away free lots on Fremont Avenue for taking a subscription to the paper. So there was only one light over the gate out there. It's called Giggling Gate. I don't know why giggling. Probably some fellow named Giggling rather than a process of laughing. But anyway, we were charmed by the busyness of this world, and that's where we first met Doc Ricketts and John Steinbeck in the little lab down the way here. And this area here was a gigantic cannery, which is many of the parts were still here after the Great Fire of 1936, which burned down everything except the two houses of prostitution. That's the only two buildings that the firemen managed to save. First things first, I suppose. But as you can see, so this painting has a kind of a feel of the dynamic quality of the Row in its midst of its season of fishing, which, as I said, was a very elaborate, complicated business of collecting the fish out of the sea, and on the seaward side of the street were all the canneries where they reduced the fish for the cans, put them in the cans. You can see here the people working on the canning chain. The fish came into those big weighing towers up at the top, and by a electric powered rotor, and then were dropped down by gravity into the chains, and the girls and men worked on the chains. As the fish came along, they grabbed fish out of the chains, out of the hoppers, and put them in the chains. Then the chains traveled along to the end of the row, where two circular saws cut off their heads and tails. So they made them about 6 inches long, just long enough to fit in the oval tins. And it was a very busy world, because the sardines had to be canned while they were fresh, or else they were relegated to the reduction plants. Of course, the canners were a little more interested in getting them into the reduction plants than they were getting them into the cans, because the reduction plants all operated automatically. 2 people could run the whole plant, whereas on the canning business it took hundreds of people putting the sardines on the chains and taking them off and canning them. So they did the best they could to discourage people, in a sense, from working too hard on the canneries and getting them into the reduction plants where they made more money. But of course the reduction plants were where all the odor came from, and it was a monstrous smell all the time. In fact, I often saw people running down the row who were not working there and not used to it, holding their handkerchiefs over their noses so they wouldn't throw up in the streets. It was such a ferocious smell. And Sam Morse at Del Monte Properties was furious with it, because it came out clear over the hill to the Del Monte Lodge, where the tourists were unhappy with it. But the canners were in control, and they just more or less laughed off old Sam's ravings and carried on exploiting the fish to the best of their ability. Ed Ricketts, whom we met in his little row house there, the one with the steps in the old Packard, that's Steinbeck asleep in the back of John Steinbeck's Packard. And that's the Packard that Jean and I, she's the gal in the red sweater and I'm in the white shirt there carrying the box. And that's Ed up at the top of the stairs telling us where to take he told us where we could get sardines. They were not used but damaged cans that had been caught in the machines and wrangled up but not broken, so the operator threw them in a box under the labeling machines, and we got them for 2.5 cents a piece. I think it was 2 for a nickel. Yeah, they were each 1 weight a pound and was very, very solid eating material, but they were also a little bit cloying after the first 2 or 3 of them. And Jean used to say that when we'd open a can in the morning, and she'd take a deep smell of them, then she wouldn't have to eat all day. In fact, we had a neighborhood cat who felt the same way. After I had eaten as much as I could, I put the oval tin down on the floor, and the cat would come up and sniff to it. And sometimes he would turn around and scratch dirt on it between his legs, which gave his opinion of the value of the sardine. They were canned in 3 different mediums. Very heavy sardine, tomato sauce, which was quite cloying, and a better tasting oil surface was probably linseed oil, which is quite good, and the mustard, which is even better. So the cans that we had all didn't have any labels, so we never knew what we were getting. Most of them were, unfortunately, the tomato ketchup, which we got very tired of. And most of the characters in this scene are actual people that were in and out of the way. The bread boy coming down the row, carrying the bread from the Roma market, probably. And here at the front is the big old Mack truck with the Hovden Cannery sardines being loaded in. And in back of the truck there, you can see the big old boilers, which are the same ones here. And when they were burned out, they would hung them out of the old vacant lot across from the lab, and people moved into them for residences. And the Blue Diner was the place where they ate their lunch. But most of the canneries had a little cafeteria, but somehow or other the Blue Diner had more glamour to it. This is John Steinbeck's old about a 1920 Dodge Roadster, which he had before he got wealthy. His first book to become a success was Tortilla Flat, and that was in 1935, about a month or 6 months, I guess, or a year after we'd met him. And prior to that time, he was unknown. We had never heard of him, and we had studied Robinson Jeffers and other famous artists in this area, but we'd never heard of Steinbeck. And Gene and I had a little job working as editors for a Monterey magazine called the Monterey Beacon, which was a flea-bitten piece of machinery, if there ever was one. And we took hold of it and edited it, and I made illustrations from linoleum blocks, which didn't cost anything, since I picked up the spare linoleum and pieces of boxwood off of Holman's backyard. And so we tried to make it into a presentable magazine. And in fact, we published one of John Steinbeck's first short stories. And he was very apologetic when he heard that we were running a magazine. He said, you don't want to have anything to do with me, because I'm bad luck for editors. He said every time they publish one of my books, they go broke. He had 2 books published at that time, and both of the publishers had gone out of business immediately afterwards. He wrote a story called The Snake, and about a gal who came up the steps of the lab one day, an old woman, very conservatively dressed, and wanted to know if Ed Ricketts would sell her a snake. And he said, "Oh, no, madam, I can't do that. It would be unprofessional. This is a laboratory, and the only reason we have snakes here is to milk them for the venom, to make anti-snake repellent shots." And so he said, "I can't sell you any." And so she was very disappointed. She said, "Well, all my life I wanted a snake of my own, and I never had one." Because John and I were sitting there in the lab arguing over something. We'd stop when the woman came in, and we tried to keep our faces straight, because we both were up on the contemporary Freudian concepts of snakes. And so we managed to keep our faces straight. And she talked Ed into taking her into the back room to see the snakes in their cages, and he kept refusing to let her to sell her a snake. And she said, "Well, can I just rent one and come and feed it on weekends?" They said, "No, madam, that wouldn't be possible." So he finally managed to urge her out and down the stairs, and he came back. We all had a good laugh over that. And John wrote his story, The Snake, which was about a woman who came to the lab trying to buy a snake from the doc, as he was called familiarly. He actually was not a doctor. It was just a popular phrase that people had given because of his erudite conversations, and the fact that he also managed to keep a Red Cross type of operation going for all the little kids with scraped knees and problems. About 3 years ago, Cannery Row people got together with me to ask me for some solution to the big empty parking lots here that had been left when the people who were going to build a big new hotel decided against it. At that time, some of the other big hotels had come in, and they were having a rough time financially. In fact, the big Plaza Hotel, which was the most elaborate before this one, went broke, and the Japanese bought it. So these people decided that they would give up on it, and they had the big foundations all started in here, big holes in the ground. So I suggested that I take some of the sketches that I made during the time when the canneries were in operation, and I got 50 young artists in the town to help out, and each one got one of my sketches of the way the canneries were in the early days, and then they proceeded to paint it in their own styles. So we all kinds of styles, from Grandma Moses to Picasso, and they only had one regulation. One was at this line, and the halfway line would be the ocean, and on the other side of the street, the halfway line would be the railroad track. And these are the people here who helped put up the murals after they were done. And we put in a long day on them, hanging them. And there was one. I decided that something had to be done to make them more secure, because they were sort of wobbly. So I made the fellows get metal hooks and metal hangers and support the back, because I had designed and built the New Wharf Theater several years earlier, and a big storm had come up, 80-mile-an-hour gale, and practically took everything down. So they all went to work, and these were the carpenters who put it up, were friends, and they put the metal pieces on. Just about the time they got them all secure, we had that big earthquake that wiped out Santa Cruz. So they all thought I was prophetic about it. Actually, I had expected a different kind of phenomenon, which was high wind. Instead, we got an earthquake. And as we walked along, each one of these murals showed one or another of the scenes on the row in the early days. This was the big oil fire that happened about 1925, and when the oil tanks, which were down across from the what's now the Coast Guard station, caught fire. And this was the net boiling, the big nets, which were the major premise of the canners. They were huge. They were, sometimes half a mile long and 200 feet high, and they had corks on the top and lead weights on the bottom to hold them down, and they made these huge walls.
Do you know why they had to boil the nets, Cruz?
Yes, because the cables and the nets became waterlogged, and then they rotted out if they weren't saturated in oak bark or tannin. So after a number of runs on the fish, they would take them and and boil them up in the oil to preserve them.
Okay, Bruce, do you remember the first time that you and Gene walked down this street and stepped into this building many, many years ago?
Well, that was in 1934, probably along about November or December. And then the canneries were in full operation at the time. And a young sculptor friend of ours knew Ed and said we had to meet him. So we came down and talked to him for a bit. And Steinbeck we met several days later here when we came back. He was just another one of the gang that happened in all the time to talk to Ed. Ed was sort of the guru of the area. He was a very intellectual, philosophically minded man who relayed his ideas on marine life and related them to human life.
I remember there was a story about Ed. He used to distill shark liver oil.
Right.
You remember that story?
Sure. People brought in the shark livers, and sometimes we went out with Ed to various parts of the bay where they captured them. And Ed would cut the livers out and bring them back. We had a big piece out in back, an old boiler, and he would boil them down, make a nasty brownish oil out of it, which he sold to shark liver oil people for dog food and things of that sort. He drank the stuff himself, tried to get Gene and me to drink it, said we'd never catch cold if we were full of that stuff. So we took a taste of it and decided we'd rather have the colds.
You know, a lot of people that we talked to said you should get Bruce to talk a little bit about Gus Gay because he was such an influence and you worked with him. Can you tell us, talk a little bit about Gus and what you learned from him as a painter, and a little bit about maybe the fact that he did other things besides painting?
Yeah, I first met Gus about 1935, about the same time I met Steinbeck. I have been doing murals for the WPA. I finished one for the high school, Monterey High School, on the early days of fishing and so on. And then Joe Danish, who was the head of the project, said, "Bruce, we need you on another mural job." Gus Gay, who has finished one of his murals, has started on it, but he's a peasant